thank you for joining us today. My name is Michaela Vrazdova, and I'm a senior attorney here at Scott Legal. Today, we are going to spend some time talking about the E-2 visa, and more specifically, we will go over some common questions we get from our clients or potential clients about the E-2 visa. So a few things I wanted to mention before we get started. So Scott Legal is a full-service immigration law firm, and we assist individuals pursuing various types of visas or green cards. And our main specialty is assisting entrepreneurs and investors. We regularly process a high number of E-2 visas, and we often process E-2 visa cases where the investment amount is on the lower side. So we will continue to have this webinar series, and we'll continue to have at least 2 webinars a month on different visa topics. At the end of this webinar, we'll send you out a few things. We'll send you a PowerPoint that will go over the E-2 visa requirements. We will send you our E-2 investor visa guide, which is a comprehensive visa guide going in detail over the E-2 visa requirements. We'll also send you a link where you can sign up for additional webinars we'll have in the future. And this webinar will also be recorded and will be made available on demand. This webinar will also be available on our YouTube channel, and we encourage you to subscribe and hit the notification button on our YouTube channel, as we often upload immigration videos. And we'll also send you a link where you can set up a consultation if you would like to discuss your personal case in more detail. So with regards to panelists today, we are lucky to have our founder, Ian Scott, who is the founder of Scott Legal and who is personally in the US on an E-2 investor visa. So he personally knows what you are going through. And finally, for any questions you have, please feel free to put them in the chat box or to the Q&A box, and we will get to them as we talk, or we'll get to them at the end of this webinar. Perfect. So why don't we get started? Ian, can you talk a little bit about who can qualify for an E-2 visa?
Great, excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Michaela. And it's great to be here. And as you mentioned, I am in the U.S. on an E-2 visa myself, so I'm a good example of who can qualify. and really, what we're looking at here is, one of the things about the E-2 visa, it is country specific. So, you do have to be a national of a treaty country in order to qualify for an E-2 visa. And there are many E-2 treaty countries all around the world. There are around 80 of them, and they span across all continents except Antarctica. So there are E-2 countries in Africa. There are many E-2 countries in Europe, in Asia, in South America, and Canada, UK, Chile, Japan. Just really a lot to choose from. But the 2 countries, the world's most populous countries, China and India, they are not E-2 treaty countries. But that's really one of the first things you have to look at when you're looking at E-2 is whether or not you are from a treaty country. And what that means from a treaty country doesn't mean that you have to be born there. It means that your passport has to be from that country. So you could be born somewhere else, have a passport from a treaty country, and as long as you have that passport from a treaty country, then you are going to be eligible. One kind of thing to note is that there is one country, if you are a national of the UK, that particular country does require that you not only have a passport from the country, but that you currently reside in the country. So if you were, for example, let's say you were living in the Cayman Islands and you spent most of your life there, but you happen to have a passport from the UK based on parents, or based on the fact that the UK would issue passports to people who lived in former colonies and things like that, that you wouldn't qualify in that instance, because there is a requirement for you to have resided, to be domiciled and reside in the UK at the time of application. So that's something to keep in mind. But that's the only country that has that particular requirement.
And what are some key requirements for the E-2 visa?
Sure. So maybe break it out into a few different areas. The first area is that you're required to invest in a business. So that can be purchasing a business, or it can be starting as investing in the business. Really means spending money. So the funds have to be, the investment has to be what's called at risk, and for the most part that means spent. So if you're buying a business, you have to actually give the money to the seller, or there are instances where you can put it in escrow, but the money does have to be at risk. If you're starting a business, it wouldn't work to, for example, just put money in a business bank account, because the government would think that you just have the ability to remove that money if you wanted to. So the at risk really comes with actually spending the money. So now in terms of the amount, that's something that is not clearly defined, but just generally for the purposes of kind of going through the requirements, there is a requirement to spend the money that is required to get the business up and running. So that's that can be different depending on the type of business. If you're purchasing a business, it's going to be the purchase price of the business normally. And if you're starting a business, you have to assess what it's going to cost, or what it would cost to get the particular business up and running, and then spend that amount of money before. And this is before you apply. It's kind of one of the scarier things with an E-2 visa, is that you are spending this money and doing these things before you actually get the visa in your passport. The second big thing that we look at with E-2 visas, or second requirement, has to do with job creation. And this is the whole reason that the E-2 visa was created in the United States. It's based on treaty, but if it wasn't for this, then the US government wouldn't have bothered doing it. But it really has to do with job creation. And so you don't have to have the jobs created at the time that you file your application, but you do, if it is a business startup, then you do have to have a business plan and a description of who and when it is that you're going to hire individuals, because the hiring of individuals is going to be a key part of the E-2 visa. So job creation is another big requirement. We talked already about the requirement, obviously, of being from a particular treaty country. And then the other kind of requirement I'd look at is that the business has to be what's called real, active, and operating. So they don't issue E-2 visas for individuals who just have the plan or the idea to start a business in the United States. They are really looking for the business to be quite advanced, or right, just at the point of starting operations. We had an applicant that went to a consulate some time ago. She was starting a gym in Arizona, and when she went to her interview, the officer asked her, "So if I went to your gym right now, what would I see?" And she said that we've signed the lease, we've opened up a bank account, we have purchased equipment, and all they're really waiting for is for me to get the visa to open the doors. And that's really what the officer wanted to hear. And, the officer ended up granting the visa. That's what the officer really wanted to hear. But the business does have to be close to, if not operational, close to operational, before they will actually grant the visa to you. So those are there's some other kind of more, I'd almost describe them as minor requirements. You have to show where it is that you obtain the money from to invest. You have to make a declaration that you plan to return to your home country if and when the visa status is terminated. But the key requirements are the ones that we went through.
And Ian, one of the most common questions we get is kind of like, what is the minimum amount of money, I can invest, so can you talk a little bit more
Sure.
about that? And then, like, what are some common E-2 visa expenditures? So what can the
Perfect.
investors
Yeah.
spend money on?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And that is, the investment amount is always a question. And I'd say that for this question, what clients are often looking for is they're looking for a specific number. And we always try and move them away from that, because it's not what the government is looking for. Like there are visas, there are visas, that one visa in particular, an EB-5 visa, where the amount is specific, right? It's $800 $100,000. It's a specific amount. It's in the regulation. But with E-2 visa, there is no specific amount that's listed. And instead, what they say is that the amount that's required to invest is going to depend on the type of business that you have. If you have a business that requires a lower investment amount to get the business up and running, then the investment amount can be lower. So for example, if you have a service-oriented business, then the investment amount could be as low as $40,000. Now, we still discuss, because spending even $40,000, we still, and you'll see when, if you ask us for our engagement letter, in our engagement letter, we say that we think that's the minimum you should spend. We have done E-2 visas with less, but we think that's the minimum you should spend. But we also say that even spending that low amount, it's going to be a risky case because spending $40,000, the government, even on a business like a service-oriented business where you can argue that all I need is a computer and a desk, right? So I can set up this business for a few $1,000s. The government is going to require that you have spent much more than that few $1,000s before they will issue an E-2 visa. But on the other side, if the business is a business that requires a lot more money to get up and running, like let's say someone's starting a business where they're doing offer services or food through a food truck, and there's a whole business with food trucks with respect to getting them built. And so let's say that the cost to get that up and running is $200,000 or $250,000. Then that is what you're going to have to spend in order to apply for an E-2 visa. And you would spend it before you get the visa. So the amount that you spend really is going to be dependent on the type of business, and what you're looking for is to spend exactly what it would cost to get that particular business up and running. Now, the other kind of comment I have with investment amount is that the other reason we kind of try to move people away from a specific investment amount number is that the one reason it's subjective, but I think that the other reason is that the investment amount is going to depend it's going to depend on a number of different things. So it's going to depend on the type of business, but it's also going to depend on where you're applying. So which consulate are you applying at? And unfortunately, when you're applying at consulates around the world, not all consulates are created equal. Some consulates will accept a lower dollar amount, and others, we wouldn't even consider applying at them with under $100,000 investment. The other thing is, if you're applying through USCIS within the United States, that they traditionally will accept a much lower investment amount. Now, the other factor that is very important when you're deciding on the investment amount is the strength of your case, right? So if you have other factors in your case that make your case strong, and we'll talk about what that means, then you probably could get away with a lower investment amount, because all the investment amount is trying to do, it's a proxy for the government to assess an amount that ultimately is going to be used to create U.S. jobs, right? So that's what it's a proxy for. So let's say that you already have created the U.S. jobs. Let's say you, or your business is such that it's clear that it's going to create U.S. jobs. Like, so we have a lot of doctors or chiropractors or dentists that come to us, and for them, their investment amount can actually be a lot lower, because when they go to a consulate to apply, or go to USCIS to apply, most consular officers can very, very quickly envision a doctor's office having employees, because who hasn't gone into a doctor's, like, you're usually not going into a doctor's office and the doctor is the receptionist, the person who's taking blood, all these different things. They're usually people in that kind of environment, and an officer can very, very quickly see that, and see that jobs jobs can be created. Similarly, restaurants, that there are a lot of positive aspects or with respect to restaurants, because obviously one person can't run a restaurant. So one of the key things that we look at when we're determining what's acceptable for an investment amount is that the other strength factors in your particular case, and we look at all of those in conjunction and communicate with clients. Say, okay, well, we think this could be sufficient. This could be sufficient. But I think that the one thing we always ask clients to kind of kind of stay away from or avoid is this, coming into a law firm and saying, well, what's the lowest amount that I can possibly invest to get the visa? Well, it doesn't really work that way, unfortunately, because the lower you go is the riskier your case is, generally speaking. And risk means, and we've had to kind of make it very clear when we speak to clients, that risk means risk of denial. It's not just a generic term, risk. It's risk of denial of your petition, right? So the more you end up spending is definitely the better chances that you have of success. And then the second part of your question, Michaela, had to do with, kind of what people spend money on, like, common E-2 visa expenditures. So really, you can spend money on anything that's required to get the business up and running. But there are, kind of lump them into maybe good versus not so good E-2 visa expenditures. So things like equipment or marketing or rent or money paid to employees, things like that are excellent E-2 visa expenditures. Things that aren't as good are money paid for legal expenses related to the actual E-2 visa. We include them, we absolutely include them, but they're not the greatest E-2 visa expenditures. Also things related to travel, the travel to and from the United States to get the business set up. We've had people try to include, Chipotle and McDonald's receipts. All of those, we strongly discourage them, because they, there are consulates around the world that actually list on their website that they don't take favorably to those types of expenditures being included. And, those ones explicitly list it, and then the other ones, even though they don't explicitly list it, you get the idea that they probably don't like them either. Other thing is kind of training. So a lot of times people will come and have these long training courses or education and, want to include it. And I kind of say, well, listen, I have an E-2 visa based on a law firm, and I paid $200,000 to go to law school, but I didn't include that in my E-2 visa expenditure list. And I know that's an extreme example, but they're it's cool. Like, generally speaking, the money that you pay to get where you are, like in terms of the training or certification, those aren't great E-2 visa expenditures, and we look at them and assess whether or not we want to include them. Cars, vehicles, those can be good E-2 visa expenditures if they're relevant to the business, right? So we've seen RFEs, not that we not our case, but cases where people have used other lawyers and then they come to us, and the RFE kind of comments that why on earth do you have this luxury vehicle for a service-oriented business that has nothing to do, even the IRS wouldn't permit it in terms of taking an expenditure. So but if you have a home renovation business, then certainly a vehicle or that's directly related to the business can be a great E-2 visa expenditure. But if it's just a business where you're saying, okay, I'm going to use the car to get to and from work, and it's just a regular, like a sedan or something like that, that's not going to be considered a great E-2 visa expenditure, and you'll get called out on it at the consulate, right? They'll say, like, why is this here? Like, why do you how is this relevant to your business? If it's clearly not relevant to the business. And then finally, the other kind of expenditure that you want to avoid is expenditures that are, not paid to independent third parties, right? So you don't want to have expenditures that are paid to relatives or friends and things like that, because the USCIS and or the consulate could question that.
And what about kind of like working capital? So can someone transfer like 40,000 on the company's bank account, and can that be considered part of the E-2 investment?
Yeah, so we will include it. So we will, when we develop our investment schedule, if someone has spent, say $60,000 and then they have $40,000 included as working capital, we will include the amount in the investment schedule. So we'll say the total investment is 100,000, where 60,000 was spent. However, the only part the consulate is looking at is for the purposes of the investment, the only part they're really looking at is the 60,000. There was within the regulations that consular officers use to adjudicate E-2 visas. In the past, there was a sentence that said that a reasonable amount of working capital can be included in the investment. And then there was another sentence that contradicted that and kind of said idle cash in a bank account can't be included. But what they did is they removed the first one from the regulations, the part that said a reasonable amount of working capital can be included in investment. So as I said, we'll still include it in our investment schedule, but really the purpose of that is getting at something a bit different than investment, where we're getting a little bit more at the viability of the company there, because we're kind of saying that if the person has working capital, then the business can sustain a period of time without having direct income.
Thank you. And we have many kind of clients who want to start consulting businesses. So what are some kind of common challenges and tips for consulting businesses? Because as you mentioned, the investment amount is usually kind of like on the lower side. So what can people do to kind of strengthen the application?
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing that they could do is hire employees before the application period, before they actually apply. The other is that find ways to increase or bolster your expenditures. Like, so for example, you could prepay rent if you like, because that's one, or prepay marketing expenditures. The other is that you can obtain a letter from a CPA that kind of goes through your business plan, goes through your expenditures, and something just to certified that says that the CPA believes that the expenditures that have been made are sufficient for this particular type of business. So that's those are definitely ways. Like we encourage people that apply, in particular at consulates, to increase the expenditure amount. And unfortunately, what it does require is that people have to spend, it's maybe counterintuitive from a business perspective, but it does require that people have to spend money that they otherwise wouldn't have spent, right? When I got my E-2 visa, I signed a 12-month lease for office space for $1,700 a month, and I didn't need it. I didn't have any clients, I didn't have any employees, and I was completely fine. I was living in Manhattan, I was completely fine working from home. But I made that expenditure and was committed for a year because I wanted the E-2 visa and felt it would be helpful for the E-2 visa, and it was. The E-2 visa was approved, and I'm sure that helped. So, and then the final thing I'd say with kind of advice for consulting business is to spend money in a wide number of areas, right? So we always, like, a good example is USCIS. They will accept, when you're doing a E-2 filing through USCIS, they will accept very low investment amounts, like so 25,000, 30,000, even less, depending on the type of business. But one of the things they're looking for is that you have spent money, and it's going to be similar in consulates, but I think it's emphasized more in this example. One of the things they're looking for is that you spent money in every category necessary for the business. So let's say that someone spent $30,000 and it was all on marketing. That's just all that they just spent $30,000 all on marketing ads. That's not going to be sufficient for a petition anywhere. Even if you spent $100,000 all on marketing, it's not going to be sufficient for a petition anywhere, because you haven't spent all of the money needed to get the business up and running, because there are many, many other things that are required to get the business up and running: equipment, lease, and different things like that. So even with a small investment amount, we tend to say spend it over a wide number of areas, so that the argument that we can make is that the applicant has spent money on lease, on equipment, on furniture, on marketing, on website. They've spent money on all the areas necessary to get this particular business up and running. And a lot of the time, it'll just be, like intuitive, right? Like if you're describing a service-oriented business, it's not going to take a rocket scientist to understand what the things that, if you're spelling it out, right, not going to take a rocket scientist to understand the things that are required to get that particular business up and running. But again, as I said, even if in your mind you feel that, well, this particular business is one that only requires you know, it only requires a small amount to get up and running, then, you know, that's not something that you know, that the fact that you feel that way, that's unfortunately the government will require a much larger amount, even though I agree that the amount to get that particular business up and running could be a lower amount.
And what about kind of like companies in the real estate industry? Like, what kind of, you know, like E2 businesses in the real estate industry could qualify for an E2?
Yeah, so the key with real estate businesses is that you are that it's an active business, so as opposed to a passive business. So maybe you know, through an example, I could describe it. Like, so if someone buys a couple of properties and then you know, renovates them and then sells them, then that's not going to be a very good E2 visa case, even if the value of the properties, you know, even let's say they bought each property for $300,000 and their total investment was $600,000, and they paid that and renovated the places and then flipped them, because that's going to be viewed as a very passive investment. It's what people do you know, what lots of people do. They have a home and they might buy a second one, renovate it and flip it and sell it. And it's a very passive activity. You don't even need a visa for that. That's, you know, it's a very passive activity. So we have had people who have done those types of house flipping and things like that and obtained an E2, but they've had many properties, like over 50 properties. So it is more of a business, right? That rather than you know, an individual endeavor. So I think that's always going to be the key. Other types of real estate that we've done real estate brokers, you know, setting up like a real estate agency. That's certainly something that can work. We've also done a lot of home renovation businesses. Like, often when people first start out, kind of defining their business as a home flipping business, we, you know, we see that a big part of the home flipping business is the home renovation aspect, and that's the part that we focus on. Because the investment amount can be lower, and you know, we can focus on the fact that the applicant plans on servicing multiple different clients, and as a result of that, you know, it kind of meets the criteria, is closer to meeting the criteria.
Thank you. And could you go over some common reasons for E2 visa denials?
Sure. So one is low investment amount. So the consulate feels that a sufficient amount hasn't been spent. Another common reason is has to do with employees. If the officer feels that you're not going to be able to hire employees, and like sometimes with this. We've had one instance in particular where the consulate looked at the applicant's current business. The applicant had a business in their home country. It was an IT consulting business, and that particular business had been operating for 15 years, and the person had never hired employees. And then this person was coming to the US to start an IT consulting business, and had a business plan saying they were going to hire employees, but the consulate wasn't convinced because they saw that the person had been doing it for quite some time and hadn't you know, hadn't hired employees. I think that another reason for denial is source of funds, and this doesn't really happen much at all in consulates, but if you're applying through USCIS, the USCIS is going to be very, very focused on where the money came from, and you really have to provide a detailed audit of where the money came from in order to have your petition approved. So that's a primary reason for denial through USCIS. I think that, yeah, and I think maybe just the other thing to comment on is that sometimes we have kind of what we'll call administrative denials. So the applicant goes for the interview and they are approved based on the merits. They've met all the E2 visa requirements, but then they're put in what's called administrative processing for some type of security check. And we're seeing that more and more, unfortunately. And it ultimately, these petitions tend to get approved, but there's just significant delays. And in some cases, even for renewals, we just had a renewal where the person went to Australia to renew their petition, and they'd been in the US for 4 years before that, and they were put in administrative processing and have been waiting for a few months now to have the visa approved. So yeah.
And Ian, you mentioned the source of funds. So can the money for the E2 investment come from a loan or a gift?
Yeah, absolutely. So it can come from a gift, and it can come from a loan. The only type of loan that we you have to be careful with is a loan where the loan is secured by the assets of the business. Now, this is not something that's prohibited. However, if the assets of the business are the security for the loan, then that prohibits the inclusion of that amount in your investment amount. So then we have to go back to the question of whether or not your investment is substantial, right? And so we generally discourage people to do any type of seller financing arrangement or have an arrangement where the assets are the security for the loan, because it increases the risk of your case. Yeah.
And what about the employees of the E-2 company? Like, do they have to be W-2 employees, or are independent contractors fine as well?
Yeah, so we definitely prefer, because this comes to when you're renewing. Because when you're doing the initial application, we're not really clear with the government of what their status is going to be, whether it's independent contractor or employee. We're just going to say staff, right? So, but then when you go to renew, it might be more of a question of which is better. So clearly clearly what is better is the employee, W-2 employee. So that's that is kind of high on the list, because it's almost like a hierarchy. Best is W-2 full-time employee. Second best is W-2 part-time employee. Then you start to go down the list, and then you say, well, what's the worst, right? Like, so worst is independent contractor part-time. And the reason that independent contractors aren't viewed as favorably is because by their very nature, they're temporary, right? Like you can't have an independent contractor that is generally that's working for you for years, right? So. And I apologize about the light. I'm not sure where it's coming from. Do you see that light?
Yeah.
Yeah. I have no idea where it's coming from, because I'm the only one in this room, and my kids aren't here, and I have no idea where the where the light is coming from. But
Yeah, I was wondering what that is.
yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what it is, but like, there is a
Perfect.
lot of light in this room, but I'm not. Yeah, I have no idea where it's coming from, but.
Perfect. And what should be kind of like the minimum amount of employees the E-2 company should have, like by the time
Sure.
they're going to renew the E-2 visa?
Yeah, so we advise people to have the equivalent of 3 employees by the time they're going to renew. So that's not a set number. We've renewed with less. Michaela just had a renewal recently where we were shocked when we got the approval. It was a USCIS renewal. And the person had, Michaela, what would
It
they have
was
had? Like
two part-time
and very
employees.
part-time, right?
Yeah.
Like, and
Yeah, like
independent
10,
contractors,
15
right?
hours.
Yes,
Yeah.
at 10, 15. So we were very surprised to get the approval without an RFE, without a request for evidence. But generally, I'd say if someone has the equivalent of 2 full-time employees, and when I say equivalent of, I mean it can be like 2 part-time. Like, let's say you say 30, 35 hours as a full-time employee, then like, it's going to be different in each state, but let's say you say 35 hours full-time employee. Then if you say 2 people that are working 17 hours or that would be considered 1 full-time employee. So the equivalent of 2 full-time employees, I think that it would be, I'd be surprised if a consulate denied an application with that, but we like to deal in certainties or closer to as close to certainties as we can. So we advise people that 3 people is a good number.
Perfect. Thank you. And can you change the kind of like the E-2 business after you get the E-2 visa?
Yeah, you can, but it might be that it requires action. So the government has a policy that says that if there is a substantive change in the business, then you need to file an amendment with USCIS or apply for a new visa at a consulate, because they're issuing the E-2 visa based on what it is that you said that you planned on doing, right? So, but that's, there's opportunity to if let's say that you're you have a pool cleaning business, and maybe you switch services to cleaning dumpsters. And I use this example because it actually is an example where we got an opinion from USCIS where USCIS said that there was no substantive change in business in that case. So, so we, the argument was cleaning and cleaning, right? It's just, cleaning pools versus cleaning dumpsters. So, if someone is a wedding photographer and then they start offering nutritional supplements to people they're taking photographs of, yeah, I think, you can argue that it's all part of a business. Like, businesses aren't rigid, right? That I'm going to just sell widgets and just do that. However, if you have a service-oriented business where you're saying, I'm going to offer tax consulting services, and then you decide to close that business and open a restaurant, that's clearly a material change, right? A substantive change. So you couldn't just do that and do nothing, right? You'd have to file an amendment with USCIS or go to a consulate and apply for a new visa. So if people want to change their businesses, we can kind of work with them to, kind of ascertain exactly what what's required in these instances. Yeah.
And we get this question sometimes when the E-2 investors, they kind of like want to buy a business in the US. Can they buy a business from their relative in the US?
Yeah, so they can, but it's a risky proposition. So because the problem is that the government may feel that nothing is really happening, right? That there's no transaction that's really occurring, and this has happened before. We had a client where they her and her husband were buying 50% of a gas station from siblings, either brother-in-law or sister-in-law or brother or sister, whatever, but somebody somebody in that situation. Now, we warned them when they did their initial application that this could be a big problem. I think she got the money from her mother. The mother gave her the money. She used the money to pay the brother-in-law, so her sister, right? So her sister's husband, pay them for the 50% of the business. Now, we warned them this could be an issue, but they went into the consulate and they were approved for 4 years. It was in Australia. They were approved for 4 years, and the U.S. consulates in Australia are very good in the sense of, they're not problem consulates at all. So then she went to renew, and she went to renew in the middle of COVID. So, went to Australia, very long quarantine period, et cetera, and then goes to her interview for a renewal. And the officer looked at the paperwork and he said to her, he goes, this application should never have been approved. He said, as far as I'm concerned, this is just money transferring around between family. You got the money from your mother, she gave it to you, and you gave it to your sister, right? And so he denied the application. And that's the risk, right? The risk is that they don't believe that there's a legitimate transaction that's occurring, right? And so again, when I say risk, again, emphasize, risk means risk of denial. It's not a generic term, risk of denial. So it is possible, but in those situations we recommend that you get a formal valuation, and that and that this particular situation was further compounded by the fact that the money came from a gift from the mother, right? So now we're kind of it's now we're kind of moving around, like it's more kind of gave the officer more of an opportunity to say this is just money moving around family, but it can always be it can always be an issue.
Perfect, thank you. And I think we got quite a few questions, so let's go over them. So the first question is, if the investment amount is $100,000, do you have to spend all of it when you start a business, or some percentage of it can be at risk? I think it means as working capital, let's say 30,000.
Yeah, so I think 100% you have to spend a lot of it, right? So we say that even for a service-oriented business, we say the minimum you should spend is $40,000, but really that may not work in many consulates. So you may even have to spend more, but certainly the minimum that we recommend is 40,000. But also we stress that is that is a low investment amount.
Perfect. So the next question is, can you start your business with one employee and then increase over time within 5 years?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's no requirement to have like it's beneficial to have an employee when you apply, but there's no requirement to have an employee when you apply. It's definitely can be helpful, but there's no requirement. I'd say the majority of the startups that we do not have employees when they first start, but as I said, it helps your case, makes your case stronger, and again, means stronger case means higher chance of approval.
Thank you. The next question is, I want to start a business consultancy firm. How much do I need to invest? Business consultancy firm does not have office set up first before applying.
Perfect. So the first part we answered already, so we won't go back to that in terms of the amounts. I think it's similar, similar to the first question. But in terms of the office setup, so this is a great question in the sense of we highly recommend having an office, even if it's a WeWork or similar type, shared suite type office space. We highly recommend it. It's never been a requirement to have office space, never ever, right? The regulations have been clear, and then they were clarified during COVID to make that clear, because there are petitions that do require office. So like when you're doing an L1 new office, the regulations say that you need a lease, right? So, but the E2 has never had that as a requirement. However, it is a very good indicator of someone being serious about a business, and I think it can help an application. So we always recommend having an office.
And especially with USCIS filings, because we
Exactly.
saw RFEs is specifically asking for like a lease agreement.
Exactly, because it supports the real and operating criteria to say that, okay, the person has office space set up and things like that. So.
Perfect. So the next question is about the employees. So do the employees have to be US citizens, or can they have an EAD, or can they be here on a non-immigrant visa?
Yeah, so they can be, any visa type as long as they have legal authorization to work. However, there is a bit of a hierarchy here as well, because the government does ask for this information. So if they're a U.S. citizen or green card holder, that's always going to be better. But you can hire people as long as they have employment authorizations, or have a visa that allows them to work in the U.S. But it definitely is better to have U.S. citizens or green card holders.
Perfect. The next question is, if the E-2 visa is denied, can you get the investment money back, which has already been invested? Like if you already purchased a business and rented a property?
Sure. So perhaps, it depends on how everything's been structured. So if you are purchasing a business, it is possible to set up that structure so that the money goes in escrow. And if the only condition of receiving the seller receiving the money, so if the way the contract works, if it says that if the E-2 visa is approved, the seller gets the money. If the E-2 visa is denied, then the money goes back to the buyer. That can definitely be arranged. So that's one way. And then if you're starting your own business, if the business doesn't get approved, then certainly if there's a mechanism to get your money back, if you purchase things that could be returned, or if you've signed a lease and included provisions that you get your deposit back if your E-2 visa isn't approved, then certainly that can be done. There's no requirement to have a visa to run a business if you're not in the United States. So you could, the business could be operational and you could hire employees, but getting your money back will really just depend on what arrangements, were made to begin with.
Perfect. The next question is, someone is asking if they can operate multiple businesses on an E-2 visa.
Yeah, you can. Yeah. So we've had, one of the cases that we did, it was a person who he had one E2 and he had a gas station, convenience store, and also a cabinet making business all in one E2. The other thing you could do is, if you want separate entities, you can get multiple E2s, one for each entity, as long as each individual entity individually qualifies for an E2.
Perfect, thank you. The next question is, what's the total time frame if someone is applying in the UK? So maybe we can just kind of discuss generally, like if there are still kind of delays at consulates because of COVID, or if it kind of got back to normal.
Yeah, I think most consulates are moving back to normal. I think there's still delays. I think the UK is advertising 45 business day to review the file, and then they give you access to their system. And I think you can schedule an appointment within a month or two after they give you access to the system. But the 45 business days, it extends for quite a while. I believe they are taking the full 45 business days to review your file. So, and then the other consulates, some are still closed, right? So there are few of those, but others are, improving. Like Toronto now is probably around a 3 month delay, but it was, a year and a half before. So, so yeah, they're making progress, but I'd say slowly, unfortunately.
Yeah. The next question, what are the requirements to extend the current E-2 employee status in the US for 2 more years?
Yeah, so you would just file, like if the person was in the US and if you want to extend rather than going to a consulate, you would file an I-129 form, for the extension with the supporting documentation. So if it's employee, it's going to be the same documentation that was provided when you applied at the consulate. But then in addition, if you're now extending through USCIS, you have to kind of reprove to USCIS that the original business meets the E-2 visa requirements. So it's going to be, the documentation that you're going to submit is going to be similar to what was submitted at the consulate, but just maybe a bit more detail, because the source of funds might be a bit more extensive through USCIS.
Perfect, thank you. The next question, I think there are 2 questions from the same person. So I think the question is asking, so there are 3 investors and they are each investing $50,000 in the business. And the question is, like, how many employees do they need to hire?
Well, in order to, a couple things. So one is that if you're getting E-2 investor visas, the maximum number of E-2 investor visas that you can get is 2, right? So one business, both parties owning 50% each, right? So that's the, because in order to get an E-2 investor visa, you have to own 50% of the company. So, now, and if you want more people to kind of participate in the E-2 process, then the third person could come in as an E-2 employee, or if you're all owning the company 33% each, then you can all apply for E-2 employee visas. Now, in terms of hiring employees, there is no, there is no kind of, when we have one investor, saying 3 employees is on average what you'd want to see. I think that if you had, kind of multiple, like certainly 2, if you had 2 investors, I'm not sure that the number would change much in terms of, maybe from 3 to 4, but I still think they'd approve the petition with 3, the equivalent of 3 full-time employees. I think that as you start to bring in E-2 employees, the number starts to go up, but I think it's not as quantifiable as the question is maybe asking. So like there's no translation to kind of, 3 E-2 employees equals 9 regular employees. There's not really a translation. I think it's just going to depend on what's going on with the business and what each of the people are doing.
Perfect. The next question is about the source of funds. So if the funds come from a gift from family, do you recommend getting a signed statement from those family members stating that it's purely a gift and that they are not members of the business and not receiving profits from the business?
Yeah, I mean, you just need a gift letter. Yeah. So they'll know that they're not members of the business just based on because we have to submit ownership documents of the business. So if they're not on those ownership documents, so the gift letter can be a simple gift letter that says that whoever is giving you the money is giving you the money as a gift, and it doesn't have to be notarized. So.
Perfect. The next question is, how long is the E-2 visa preparation and what's the processing time? So yeah, we kind of like went over that already.
Yeah, exactly. And for us, in terms of for us to prepare the file, after we get all the documentation from a client, we take 15 days to finish the file.
The next question is, will buying a liquor store be a good business for the E-2? So maybe just generally, like are some businesses better for the E2 visa than others?
Yeah, I think that it sounds like a good business, and it's as long as the business will have employees. And the key thing with E2 visa businesses is having employees. So that's always going to be the first and foremost. If the business can support employees, then that's going to be a good E2 visa.
Perfect. The next question is, so someone is outside the US, they set up an LLC, and the question is whether they can open a bank account in the US.
Well, if a bank will open, so the procedure for opening up a bank account is going to be bank specific. Most banks want to see a person, right? The person who's opening up the bank account. So depending on, but sometimes we've had people able to open up a bank account based on the fact that they have a prior relationship with the bank, right?
Yeah.
But in terms of, I check with the bank that you plan on opening an account with, because they will all have different, they'll all have different rules.
Yeah, or you can always come on a B visa and like open the bank account.
Exactly. Like most people that do E2s have visited the United States before they apply.
Yeah.
We've had 2 instances, I believe, where in all of the E2s, we've had hundreds of E2s. I think we've had only 2 instances where the person has not been to the US before they applied. And those instances, as we're talking about bank accounts, one of the clients they were, it was 2 brothers, and they were very, very, very young, and they were trying to open a bank account, and they couldn't, and they hired a company to open up a bank account for them. It wasn't a company in the US. I think the company was in India, if I'm not mistaken. And the company took $1,000 from them and said that they would open up the bank account. And as you can imagine the end of that story, right? So let's just say they didn't ever get a bank account open, and they didn't get their $1,000 back. So, but they, the good thing was they did actually get approved, and they did end up coming to the US and starting their business. So.
Perfect. The next question is about the source of funds. So if the money is coming from a gift, do we need to kind of like show documents, like showing where the donor got the money?
Definitely, yeah. So if the money comes from a gift, it's basically the same requirement as if the money came from the individual, that you have to show where the person got the money from. And that requirement is going to be kind of more prevalent if the file is in a place where the source of funds is scrutinized more. Like, so London doesn't have a page limit, so that the source of funds is quite extensive. Similarly, USCIS, if the file, they don't have page limits and want to kind of an audit almost of the source of funds. But that is generally a requirement. We won't focus on it much at consulates, but we do say to people, that it's a good idea to bring the information with you.
Yeah. The next question is about the office space. So can you get like an office space with WeWork, and does it have to be a dedicated desk, or can you just kind of like sign up for just like the co-working space?
Yeah, so I think co-working space is fine, but like WeWork, but we do think a dedicated desk is good. We do have a blog post. If you just go on our website and then you just Google home office E2, there's a blog post that talks about exactly this question of what we think about a home office and what the requirements should be if you get an office if you get an office. So you could just, it'll be easy to find on our website.
Yeah. The next question is if the E2 investor or the E2 company can hire a relative as an E2 employee.
So they can, but it's not going to count as an employee in any of the numbers that I talked about.
Yeah. The next question is someone opened an LLC, and the CPA put nature of business as retail instead of consulting. How to amend? Yeah, so this you just need to discuss with your CPA. The next question is it expected that the business will support living expenses of the E2 investor, or must the investor show non-business income or other resources to cover the living expenses?
Well, it's not an explicit requirement, but I think it's always good that, if the business looks like it's supporting the, through a business plan, that it looks like it's supporting the owners, because if not, then the government might question why the person would even bother, right?
Yeah. The next question is if someone can apply for an E2 if they are already living in the US on an F1 or TD status.
Yeah, they can. Yeah, no problem. It could either do it through USCIS or they could just apply at their consulate. Yeah.
Yeah. The next question is if the investor stated in the business plan that he'll be hiring employees within 2-3 years, but I think the investor is not able to eventually kind of like reach this goal. Like what should this person do at the renewal stage? So maybe we can just kind of like generally discuss, if the projections of the business plans are kind of like not met at the renewal stage.
Yeah, so at the renewal stage, we don't tend to kind of go back to business plans and talk about the projections. We tend to just focus on how many employees are there. So if you had a projection that you were going to hire 10 employees and then you'd only hired 3, then it's not going to be a problem, right? We're just going to say the person has hired 3 employees. But if you had a projection to hire 10 and you hadn't hired any, then the issue isn't so much that you had a high projection, it's just that you haven't hired any. So at the renewal stage, we really are just focusing on, focusing on what you have done, and comparing that to the benchmark of the equivalent of 3 full-time employees. And as long as you've met that, then you're not going to have a problem. The only time we revisit business plans is if the person has not kind of hired many or any people, and then we still might try to argue that, well, they didn't hire because of X, Y, Z, and they're implementing these changes, and this is what their business plan is going to look like, as a last ditch effort to try and still get the renewal through.
Perfect. Then we have 2 questions about kind of processing timelines at 2 consulates. So one question is about Toronto. So Toronto, we are seeing from the time we submit the petition, you will be invited to schedule an interview in like a week, and then you'll be probably able to get an interview in like 3 months, like 2 to 3 months. The second question is about timeline at Colombian consulate. I don't know from the top of my head because I haven't filed there recently. So we would kind of like, I don't know if you, Ian.
Well, I think it's bad. Like, I think Colombia, I think it's been a big problem. I think that there's actually a lawsuit right now where there's a group that's suing the consulate because they haven't been adjudicating applications for some time. So there may be some movement as a result of kind of that, right? But yeah.
Yeah. Then there's next question asking about our fees for an E2 visa. Yeah, so just email us and we can send you the engagement letter. The next question is asking if an E2 investor gets married, can his spouse get an E2 visa? So yes, your spouse would just apply at the consulate and would need to bring the original of the marriage certificate and then can get the E2 visa. And how much do we charge? So again, email us and we can send you the engagement letter. The next question, do you have any CPA who can guide in setting up or amending an LLC? So none come to my mind, but
yeah, I mean, if it's in New York, we can do it, but if it's in any other state, we cannot. So
yeah. And the last question we have is my parents who both have B1, B2 visas, can they stay with me in the States as long as my E2 visa goes?
Well, perhaps. So there is a provision that permits in certain circumstances for immediate relatives like that to join the E2 visa applicant, join the E2 visa applicant, and they still are admitted on B1, B2, but they have to kind of continually renew renew the application. So it's there is facility or ability to do that. What I'd say is that if if you set up an E2 consultation, you can talk about that more with the lawyer that that you set up the consultation with, where we can kind of go through the specific requirements to be able to meet that. And there is an article on our website as well. You just have to kind of Google it, unfortunately, because I don't have it. We have thousands of articles on our website, but I know that we do have an article on our website that deals with family members joining E2 applicants.
Yeah. Let me see. I think we got some to the final questions. Is there any employee who speaks Turkish who work in your law office to help for an E2? Yeah, so unfortunately, no. And the second last question is, who will take care of my E2 visa application?
Yeah, so we have five lawyers at the firm, and all of which are experienced E2 lawyers, and then Kelly, the managing attorney, and myself. One of the two of us act as a review function for all petitions that go out. So including E2 visa petitions. So but it's a very small team, so it's a very collaborative work environment where when people have questions, they raise those through to other team members. So
Perfect. Yeah, so these were all the questions we got. So thank you so much, Ian, and
thank you,
so
Michaela.
much, everyone. And yeah, have a good Friday.
A great weekend. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.